Ever wondered how Kenya, a vibrant nation with a rich history, ended up under British rule for nearly 70 years? The story isn't simple. It's a complex tale of ambition, power, and the relentless pursuit of freedom. Let's rewind to the late 19th century, a period famously known as the scramble for Africa. European powers were carving up the continent like a cake, and Britain had its eyes on a particularly valuable slice, East Africa. So, why Kenya? It was all about strategy and resources. At the 1885 Berlin Conference, European leaders drew lines on a map, and the land we now know as Kenya fell into Britain's sphere of influence. Initially, a private company, the Imperial British East Africa Company, was tasked with managing the territory starting in 1888. Think of it as outsourcing an empire. However, running a colony is expensive, and the company soon went bankrupt. This forced the British government to step in directly. In 1895, they officially established the East Africa Protectorate, marking the formal beginning of colonial rule. One of the biggest projects of this era was the construction of the Uganda Railway, often grimly nicknamed the Lunatic Express. This massive undertaking aimed to connect the port of Mombasa on the coast to the interior, all the way to Uganda, to secure trade routes and exert control over the entire region. To build this railway, Britain brought in thousands of indentured laborers from India. These workers, and the traders who followed, formed the foundation of Kenya's South Asian community, adding another layer to its diverse cultural fabric. The railway opened up the interior, but it also paved the way for something far more disruptive: settler colonialism. The British government didn't just want to control Kenya, they wanted to populate it with their own people. The fertile, temperate highlands, home to communities like the Maasai and Kalenjin for generations, were deemed perfect for European settlement. So, the colonial administration began a process of land alienation, systematically displacing African populations from their ancestral homes and allocating the best land to white settlers. Imagine waking up one day to find your family's farm, the land your ancestors had worked for centuries, now belonged to a stranger who had just arrived. This dispossession was not just an economic blow. It was a deep cultural and spiritual wound. To make the new settler farms profitable, the colonial government needed a cheap and reliable source of labor. How did they get it? Through a series of coercive policies. They introduced measures like the hut tax in 1902. Every household had to pay a tax in cash. Since most rural Kenyans didn't use cash in their local economies, the only way to earn it was to leave their own farms and work for low wages on settler plantations or public projects. This was essentially forced labor, designed to push Africans into the colonial wage economy and serve the interests of the settlers. The system was built on a foundation of racial hierarchy. For decades, Africans and Asians were denied any real political voice. The Legislative Council, the colony's governing body, was dominated by white settlers, who made laws that benefited themselves at the expense of everyone else. In 1920, Britain cemented its control by officially declaring the territory the Kenya colony, making its intentions crystal clear. But the people of Kenya did not simply accept this fate. From the very beginning, there was resistance. Early protests in the 1920s, led by figures like Harry Thuku, challenged forced labor and taxation. These movements were the seeds of a much larger struggle to come. As the years went on, the grievances piled up: stolen land, economic exploitation, and the daily indignity of racial discrimination. The frustration and anger simmered, and eventually it boiled over into one of the most famous anti-colonial wars in African history. The Mau Mau Uprising, starting in 1952, a guerrilla movement comprised largely of Kikuyu fighters, rose up against the British. The Mau Mau Uprising was a brutal and complex conflict. The fighters, who saw themselves as land and freedom army, targeted colonial infrastructure and settlers. The British response was swift and merciless. They declared a state of emergency, detaining hundreds of thousands of Kenyans in concentration camps where torture and abuse were rampant. While the British military eventually suppressed the armed rebellion by 1960, the Mau Mau had shattered the illusion of peaceful colonial rule. The sheer cost of the war, both in money and in reputation, made it clear to Britain that holding on to Kenya was no longer sustainable. The uprising acted as a powerful catalyst for change. The global political climate was also shifting. The era of empires was ending, and the call for self-determination was growing louder across Africa and Asia. Bowing to internal and international pressure, the colonial government began to introduce constitutional reforms. Slowly, Africans were granted more political representation. By 1960, for the first time, the Legislative Council had an African majority. The path to freedom was finally in sight. Negotiations began in London, led by a new generation of Kenyan leaders, including Jomo Kenyatta, who had been imprisoned by the British for his alleged role in the Mau Mau movement. Finally, on December 12, 1963, the British flag was lowered and the new flag of Kenya was raised. After decades of struggle, sacrifice, and unwavering resilience, Kenya was an independent nation. Jomo Kenyatta became its first prime minister, later its president, and began the challenging task of building a new nation from the ashes of a colonial past. The legacy of this period is still visible today, shaping Kenya's politics, its economy, and its very identity. It's a powerful reminder that history is not just something that happens. It is something that is fought for, won, and continuously shaped by the will of the people. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through Kenya's colonial history. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that have shaped our world. Let me know in the comments what piece of history you'd like to explore next. Until then, stay curious.